Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Mario Cristobal, the Miami Hurricanes, really wasting no time doing their due diligence in terms of trying to make this roster better heading into 2025 in the spring transfer portal window. Now, we've talked extensively. There are a few obvious positions that you think Miami will try to address. But the majority of additions that I think Miami is going to make is just making sure the depth is in a good enough spot heading into 2025. Now, Braxton Felly from Boise State, who Miami has taken a very close look at, to me checks the exact box, is the exact kind of player that Miami is looking for on the inside of the defensive line, where you feel really good about your top end talent. You talk about David Blay, you talk about Justin Scott, you talk about Ahmad Moten. We feel really good about those three football players heading into 2025. But the conversation is, all right, who is defensive lineman number 4, 5, and 6? The guys that have to play 10 to 15 to 20 snaps a game. Are we good enough in terms of depth on the defensive line? Braxton Felly makes a ton of sense. So he's not going to come in and start for Miami in 2025. He's not going to come and be a first team all ACC guy, but he's going to come in and do exactly what you're looking to do. Fire hydrant build at 6'1", 300 pounds, a guy that plays extremely hard, that has a very high motor, that has a ton of playing experience at Boise State. The thing with Braxton Felly that intrigues me the most when you turn on the tape is he plays extremely hard. In this era of college football, especially in the spring transfer portal window where you're trying to get players, it's important to make sure they're coming for the right reason. I think a really good example is Tyler Barron, who is a extremely gifted football player, elite caliber athlete that you saw at times during Miami in 2024 play some really good football. I think that the big sticking point, you might say, with Tyler Barron is it wasn't consistent. You could tell he probably wasn't playing as hard as he should have been at times during that season. When you try to go get players in the portal, you run the risk of having guys that might be coming to the program for the wrong reasons. Braxton Felly's not one of those guys. You're not going to find many defensive linemen across the country that play the way Braxton Felly does, and he's not going to be a guy that comes in and has 10 plus sacks and 15 tackles for loss. He's kind of a shorter, sawed off defensive lineman that plays with really good pads. And although he's not overwhelmingly big, because he has that short, stout build, he does a really nice job, holding at the point of attack and being a guy that can do some dirty work and eat up double teams. A guy that, again, I think can come into Miami and play quality 15 to 20 snaps a game for Miami. That's what we're looking for, because you look at the depth chart and say, hey, you look at the defensive line, we love the top end talent. But when it gets to, Artavius Jones or true freshman Dante Simpson, especially with a guy like Josh Horton transferring out, we kind of have some question marks about who our 4th, 5th, and 6th defensive linemen are. And Braxton Felly would come in and make you feel better about where Miami sits from a depth standpoint on the defensive line. Now, there's another really interesting conversation to have as you're talking Miami in the transfer portal, and that is, hey, is Miami over recruiting their high school talent? You've seen this conversation be had on Twitter, be had on the message boards, and quite frankly, I really appreciate the Miami Hurricane fans thinking about this, because there's a lot of college football fans across the country that they just want players. They just want new toys to talk about. Yeah, it's fun to talk about new players, but in this era of college football where you're trying to balance out how you want to build your roster, you do want to make sure that you're giving the opportunity to your high school talent to develop and become difference makers. Want to get into that conversation a little bit as well. I would love to hear from the Miami Hurricane fans. Look, I've seen a lot of Miami fans kind of sit on both sides of the fence here. It's kind of the beauty of talking this sport in the month of April. Like, we're going to have a lot of these conversations where we might not totally agree on. That's the beauty of talking football in the spring. Before we get into it, number one, would love to hear from you guys in the comment section. If you agree or disagree, that would really like to hear some input. The amount of support the Miami Hurricane fans have shown. Again, whether we're agreeing or disagreeing, it's been amazing. Can't thank you guys enough. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into this conversation real quick. And the conversation about over recruiting the high school talent has primarily been around the wide receiver position. Now, the one position that I think is pretty clear is at the quarterback spot, right? Cam Ward comes in last year, Carson Beck comes in this year. I don't think Miami's over recruiting the high school ranks. I think that has a lot more to do with you kind of missed on some guys at the high school ranks, specifically a guy like Judd Anderson and a guy like Emory Williams was probably not ready to come in and win 10 games for Miami in the 2025 year. And so you've had to do it a couple of years. I would argue that that's going to change over the next couple of years, where you have Luke Nickel coming in as a true freshman. You have Darian Coleman coming in the 2026 class, who I think is an absolute stud. The more success Miami has with quarterbacks, you had a ton of success with Cam Ward. You hope to have a lot of success with Carson Beck. I think Miami will be able to recruit the quarterback position out of high school a little bit better. I think there's been some misses at the high school ranks. A guy like Judd Anderson has come in. He doesn't seem like he's going to be a starting quarterback for Miami. But the more success you have with quarterbacks, the easier it is to get these elite quarterbacks to come to your program out of high school. I would guess that's going to change. You look at the running back position, that's homegrown high school talent. You look at the offensive line position. I mean, a lot of these guys were recruited out of high school. The question is at the wide receiver position. I would say it's not as big of a problem as I think maybe some Miami fans might think on the surface, where you look at it and say, look, Isaiah Horton, he was developed, unfortunately left Miami, but that was a successful high school recruitment where you developed him into a really good football player. You certainly can say the same thing for Xavier Restrepo. You can probably say the same thing about Jacoby George, and he might have had another gear that he might have not reached at Miami. I think you have a lot of young wide receivers that you like on this roster. I think why Miami might be going to the portal at the wide receiver position is not, hey, we don't think we have the talent in the room. It's just a thin room that lacks experience. I look at this wide receiver room, especially with what we've heard from Malachi Tony and Joshua Moore and Dalen Upshaw. We think we have some studs that are coming up through the ranks. The conversation is, hey, do we want to have to rely on multiple true freshmen at the wide receiver position to contribute at a high level in 2025? That might not necessarily be ideal. So you kind of combine the idea that, one, we're just thin, especially with a guy like Nikar leaving the program. We don't have a ton of experience. I don't think Miami is over recruiting their high school talent. I think it has a lot more to do with, hey, this is just a thin wide receiver room where if we have the opportunity to bring in some difference makers, we're going to do so. I would like to hear that, because then you go to the defensive side of the football too. I mean, the majority of this front seven is guys Miami's recruited. You look at Ruben Bain, Armando Blunt, Ahmad Moten, Justin Scott, Hayden Lowe. Linebacker room, Popo, Bobby Pruitt, Kellen Wiley, Chase Smith. The only position that has really been supplemented in a meaningful way is the secondary. And quite frankly, you just needed to. You missed on a lot of guys at the high school ranks. That was a position that was coached poorly, probably wasn't recruited to the level we needed it to. And so we're bringing some more guys in. Mario Cristobal is one of the coaches, and this kind of goes to the roster building strategy of Miami. He's going to look to make this roster as good as possible. It starts at the high school ranks, and he's done a very good job recruiting the high school ranks. And I would argue that the development at the high school ranks has been pretty good, especially at certain positions like the offensive line. But at the end of the day, Mario Cristobal is one of those coaches that we're going to bring in as much talent to this program as we can. And look, if some of these high school kids, some of these kids we recruited out of high school who are young players on this roster beat out the transfer portal additions, they're going to play. But we're going to try to get as much talent onto this football team as we possibly can. Now, a couple more portal targets that I think are worth monitoring. We talked about Braxton Felly. I think would make a ton of sense. And quite frankly, there's not a ton of defensive linemen that I trust to be solid rotational players for Miami on the defensive line. I think Braxton Felly is one of them. Kind of interested to see what other names emerge. The other name that's been linked to Miami meaningful ways is Trebor Pena from Syracuse. To me, I get it. It might be frustrating that, Ray Joseph might not get the opportunity that maybe he wanted going into year three. I would argue that, Miami has seen him. He's been in this program for 2.5 years now. If Miami doesn't have a ton of confidence for Ray Joseph to come in and replace Xavier Restrepo, it makes sense to go to the transfer portal. And at the end of the day, this is a hard guy to pass up. He is literally Xavier Restrepo 2.0 in terms of the skill set that he provides to Miami, and also checks off that box of, hey, we need some more bodies. And Trebor Payne is a guy that's been productive at the power four level that can come in and be a 6-year senior in a very young wide receiver room. Like, to me, that makes a lot of sense. The other position we've been sneaky kind of talking about is the running back position. It's going to be a very, very difficult position to address, right? When you have Mark Fletcher and Jordan Lyle, it's going to be hard to get a running back to come to Miami because the path to playing time immediately in 2025 is difficult. And we know that a lot of these portal guys, they're transferring because they want more opportunity. To me, you probably the ideal kind of running back to bring in is a younger running back that has proven production. Well, there is a name in the portal that kind of matches that up. Tramar Brown, coming from North Dakota State, ran for over 1,100 yards as a redshirt freshman for North Dakota State in the 2024 year. Does this not make perfect sense? You've seen Miami get tied to Raphael from North Carolina State. He's a guy that I think has only 2 years of eligibility remaining. To me, you bring in Shamar Brown and say, hey, you have 3 years of eligibility remaining, so you can be a guy, but you also have proven production, and that's what we're looking for. We're looking for to bring in a running back that, can be a running back 3 that we trust. Shamar Brown has that because he ran the football over 200 times for North Dakota State in the 2024 year. But he's also a guy that has 3 years of eligibility. So what you can sell to Shamar Brown is, one, hey, you're a running back 3 for the Miami Hurricanes coming from North Dakota State. That seems to be a very appealing kind of proposition for a guy like Shamar Brown. You might not play a ton in the 2025 year because we have Mark Fletcher and Jordan Lyle. Hey, you got 3 years of eligibility to kind of work your way into that rotation. And at the end of the day, he can be a depth running back 3 in 2025, but potentially offer some big time upside in the 2026 and 2027 year. This one to me makes a ton of sense because you're getting a guy that has some high upside in the future for Miami, but at the same time is giving proven production that we kind of need to inject at that running back 3 position. One more name I'll throw out there, Tamir Robinson from Penn State at linebacker. Maybe lacks the production and playing time and experience that Miami might be looking for. There's a lot of upside here. And you've seen Miami really lean into the upside in terms of linebackers. Like the athletic profile that Miami's recruiting, hey, we want guys that, even if they are some guys that might need to be developed a little bit, a Kellen Wiley or Bobby Pruitt, we want guys that possess that high upside. And Tamir Robinson, played over 100 snaps, I believe, for Penn State in 2024. So he has some playing experience, but also has a big frame that's kind of juiced up. That's another name maybe to watch. You haven't seen a ton of linebackers and safeties that have popped into the portal that you think could really help Miami immediately. So that's a position where you're just kind of continuing to monitor. I think Tamir Robinson could be an interesting one. We'll continue to work through this conversation as we continue to see the names pop in the portal. And quite frankly, as Miami still, it might lose some more names to the portal in the next coming days. That'll change the conversation a little bit. As it sits right now, I'm not too worried about Miami over recruiting the high school talent because at the end of the day, yes, there are certain guys that maybe haven't worked out, a Zaquan Patterson, a Nikar, Ray Joseph. There's a lot of guys that Miami has hit on, and there's a lot of guys that Miami has recruited over the last couple of years from the high school ranks that are difference makers for Miami. And it's really easy to point to the few examples where that's not the case. I think there's a lot of examples where Miami is doing a really good job recruiting their guys out of high school, developing them into difference makers on Saturday. Would love to hear from you guys. I know it's a conversation that a lot of Miami fans have been going back and forth on Twitter, on the message boards. I think it's a very fascinating conversation. Like these are the conversations we should be having in the spring in regarding to the sport of college football. Let it fly in the comment section. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.